Okay, Gary, could you start by just describing some of the work you've done in India? I know you've done some teaching there and representing clients, but just whatever you can tell us.
I've done both of those. When I was back in some time ago in the Commerce Department, I had very interesting negotiations with India on the subject of trade remedies and countervailing duties in particular, but no anti-dumping as well in Geneva and in Delhi. And actually, I was just there less than a month ago at a conference. Had a great time. So I've been there several times.
Good, thank you. As you know, this particular session is focusing on possible changes in the WTO system, and I want to get your thoughts on the appellate body crisis. And first of all, the U.S. concern is that the appellate body is going well beyond its mandate, is creating new rights and obligations instead of simply interpreting the agreements. Do you think there's any merit to that position?
Well, first of all, I think we have to look at terminology. Historically, when people, you and me, said the U.S. in trade, it meant USTR had gotten sign-off from all the other agencies. The White House was behind it. Both congressional committees were behind it. U.S. business was behind it. U.S. agriculture was behind it. This is quite the opposite. U.S. business and agriculture badly wants binding dispute settlement. Turns out, so do labor unions now, and environmental groups, and both committees in Congress, and the other agencies of the U.S. government. So I would more accurately say, with all respect, the Trump administration does not want, they've made it quite clear, they think, and this is a legitimate argument, that anything that binds the U.S. from international tribunals diminishes our sovereignty. And behind this is a trade policy view that they don't care what happens to U.S. exports. All they care about is keeping out imports. And they're very open about this. So, no, they don't want binding dispute resolution in WTO. They don't want it anywhere. So in the recent renegotiation of NAFTA, you will see that the U.S. tried very hard to abolish all binding dispute resolution, not just on dumping countervail. You will also note that the U.S. backed down.
Okay, I'd like to turn now to the other sort of potential existential crisis, which is the national security issue. As I'm sure the audience knows, the U.S. is taking the position that when it invokes the National Security Clause, Article 21 of the GATT, that cannot be litigated, that the U.S. has the sole right to decide whether or not a particular measure is necessary. And I'd be curious to know how you think that one's going to come out. And I guess we've got it coming up in two other cases, the Ukraine, Russia, and Qatar, Saudi.
That's a key point. I tend to legal realism. So you have three cases on the subject, well, three sets of cases, because there are many cases, not only on the US 232, but I think the Saudi one, the one involving Qatar and Saudi Arabia is multiple cases. So there's many cases. So look at those cases on the ground, as we say. So Russia, Ukraine, there's a war going on. Shooting war, Russia invaded Ukraine. Whatever you want to make of it, there's an actual war. Saudi Qatar is a blockade, which is pretty, getting into Cold War territory. U.S. is protecting an industry where the Pentagon says the U.S. only needs 3% of its production for full security. So the 3% is not just military hardware, it's the full definition of bridges, roads, the whole thing. And indeed, as everyone's well aware, if you need more steel in a war, you simply shut down automobile and appliance production, which is what the U.S. did in World War II. 139 cars were made after 1942. Because that's a lot of steel you can use for other things.
Yeah.
So, there's an interesting legal question to what extent it's self-judging, and arguably some of the language is and some of it isn't. But at bottom, it's the weakest of the cases on the facts. And indeed, I note, and then secondly, I filed a case a few months ago seeking in federal court here to declare the relevant statute, which President Trump is using unconstitutional. There's nothing to do with trade law. It's a constitutional issue. We had the oral argument on Wednesday, just 2 days ago. I think it went well, but I'm a litigant, so leave me out of it. But certainly the judges were well prepared, and the Justice Department did not have good answers for all their questions. So my advice on those cases: delay. Use the end of the appellate body to delay further, because so if the U.S. wants to arbitrate it, maybe consider that, maybe not. Let's see how the case in the U.S. plays out. We should get an opinion. It's a 3-judge court, and obviously it's up to the court. And meanwhile, I should add, there's a very relevant other case already before the U.S. Supreme Court. Not related to trade, but related to this question of vagueness in drafting. And so depending on how the Supreme Court goes there, that could solve the problem for WTO.
Okay.
Fairly soon, this year, next year.
Sure. Going back to WTO cases, I mean, do you have a prediction as to which way they might come out? Will the panel, appellate body, say, yeah, you can do what you want, in which case presumably anybody can then do anything and say national security, or will they go the other way?
I don't know. No. And the U.S. is trying to threaten them, saying we'll be mad if you rule against us, but that's an empty threat because the U.S. is already trying to abolish them. So you've already used that weapon up. So the question of national security is very difficult, and you don't want to get into it, which is why people didn't use these measures. There's a reason they weren't used.
The Holmes burden was settled by, I think, the EU and the US.
At the last minute.
Yeah.
And so this is a particularly bad case. The Secretary of Commerce was on the board of a big steel company until he became Secretary of Commerce. The U.S. Trade Representative spent his career and made all his money representing, U.S. steel companies trying to get what they got in 232. That kind of background music doesn't go over well at WTO.
Right. Do you think the U.S. would pull out of the WTO if it loses?
No, of course not.
Okay.
The U.S. Economy makes, $100 billion a year in royalties from TRIPS. There's a reason why if you go back to the Uruguay round, the core deal in the Uruguay round was the U.S. agreed to give up textile quotas in return for IP and services, particularly IP. Until then, as you painfully remember, the textile industry, textile and apparel here, always won in Congress by 80% of the votes, until they had to fight Microsoft and Pfizer and Disney. And they'd never had to fight people like that. The Uruguay round vote was 76% to 24 in both houses by coincidence, running over the textile industry. So I can't believe the IP industry, and IP is way more important to U.S. industry now than it was in 1994.
Sure.
I can't believe they would want the U.S. to pull out of WTO.
Good. Okay. That's an encouraging.
Or let it. And I note the statute for the Uruguay round clearly requires congressional involvement. There's a good, very sound constitutional argument the president, by him or herself, cannot pull out of NAFTA. But it's quite clear, Uruguay round, you need Congress. And like I say, the IP lobby, you wouldn't want to try and fight them.
Right. Do you think, in light of the Doha lack of success, does that mean, do you think that'll be the last of the attempt to come up with a multilateral agreement? Will it now come to these sort of variable geometry and these agreements like TISA?
Well, the plurilateral agreements we have so far, which were financial services, zero tariffs for electronics, and telecoms, do not include all
government procurement.
Yeah, and government procurement. Do not include all WTO members, but they include 80, 90, 95% of trade. So if you tell me that's what's going to happen, it's unfortunate, that we can't make deals with including everyone, but eventually everyone has to sign on. It's sad but true. I would get more bothered if you told me it was a plurilateral agreement of the US, you know, and EU, China, and India, leaving smaller countries out. That would be a problem for me. But if you have most of the world, most of the economically active world in it, and I note that those agreements include lots of countries, poor countries, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, who think that the path to development is through participation in those deals, as long as those deals give them sufficient leeway.
Right.
And that's part of negotiating a plurilateral agreement. I see no reason that can't be done in services.
Any thoughts on where the WTO system might be in 5 or 10 years' time?
Well, the main threat to it is not so much Donald Trump, although he's symptomatic. It's just like you see with the EU, is people now take for granted the benefits of GATT WTO, just as they in Europe, including UK for the moment, a lot of them take it for that for granted, and that's dangerous. It's a well-known phenomenon that these deals last until the last negotiator retires, and then people forget why they did it. I think the economics are clear, and socially also, if you look at all the indicators, including non-economic indicators, the human development indicators, UN, they're all straight up since post-World War II economic integration. I'm not saying they're perfect, and countries have to figure out how to deal with resulting inequalities, and there's a problem there in a lot of countries. But if you look at all the indicators, boy, you know, life expectancy, maternal and infant mortality down, life expectancy up, access to clean water way up. It'd be foolish to get rid of this system just because you've forgotten why you have it.
Yeah. I saw interesting, I'm sure you know this, but I saw a figure the other day that more than half of trade now is value chains. And I would think that would be a very strong incentive to keep the current system, that they are dependent so much on a low or zero tariff regime. Okay, Gary, your thoughts on TPP?
TPP goes into effect in 8 days, now called CPTPP. The 11 members by themselves are 13% of world GDP, which makes them as the largest FTA in the world, I think. Arguably, you get into EAA and all that, but whatever. It's big by itself. They've made perfectly clear they want to expand. The following countries have made perfectly clear they want to join as soon as possible: Korea, Colombia, the United Kingdom. Those 3 alone get you up to 20%, which is bigger than China, almost as big as the US or EU. And there's, you know, and they're not reluctant to add more. And I should explain, I don't want to go into great detail, because of the nature of its negotiation. First, as a very close negotiation among Singapore, Chile, New Zealand, and Brunei, none of whom really trade that much with each other, setting out to draft a good trade agreement. As an example, that was the P4. That went into effect in 2006. Within a year, Australia, Peru joined, 18 months, Vietnam. At that point, the US wanted in. Then Malaysia, seeing Vietnam want in, says, oh my God, if the US is in and Vietnam's in and we're not, we're going to lose out, which is how trade agreements grow. And so you then have a 12-country negotiation. And so it wasn't dominated by any one of them. US and Europe are used to having more bargaining power, but it doesn't work as well with 12 countries as bilaterally.
And including Japan, which is
not small.
Yeah.
But even without Japan, because it started without Japan. So in effect, you get all these 12 countries rubbing against each other. And I don't mean that in a bad sense. And it rubbed off a lot of the hard parts of the agreement. And then, so you leave behind an agreement that really isn't that country specific. and a lot of its annexes, which are country specific, which makes it easier for a new country to join. Then the US pulls out, so the other 11 suspend everything the US wanted. I note suspend, not delete. They want the US to join. But that makes it even easier to join. And then politically, the final piece is it's always difficult. There's nothing to do with Trump or anyone else. It's always difficult for any other country to sign any agreement with the US because it's just politically more fraught. An agreement to have a mutual recognition of Mother's Day would be harder with the US. So now you have this pretty well thought out agreement that benefited enormously from the smart people at USTR. So you have all the benefits of negotiating, which are really smart bunch of people, and all the others had really smart negotiators. You have a pretty good agreement that's not constructed for one binary pair of countries. So one, it's not that hard to join. So yes, very quickly I would think Korea, Colombia, UK, if the UK is able to sign trade agreements. If not the UK, they'll work something out with the EU. So I view TPP as tremendously important, and obviously something a country like India has to think about. The parallel somewhat is RCEP, which did not include the US ever, and that includes India and China. So potentially RCEP's even bigger. It was postponed till next year. This is not an ideological question. It simply is whatever's, and because of the way trade agreements grow. So will RCEP, if it's completed next year, be more attractive than CPTPP? And that's not an ideological question, and it's not a foreseeable question. I can't tell you this minute whether the answer is yes or no for any given country, because we don't know what RCEP will look like. And even if we knew what it looked like, it's an empirical question. How many countries decide to then join up with RCEP versus TPP? They're not mutually exclusive.
I could say that they could join both.
And we're going to rename TPP because once the UK joins, it'll be back to PX, P plus X. What we've been discussing is an interesting panorama for India. The Indian economy is perfectly positioned to take advantage of all these. India has lots of smart trade negotiators and economic analysts. So there are choices for India. India is a democracy. So these are choices democracies made. The US 2016 made one choice. And you see the negative effects on our economy already. But there are positive choices that countries, democracies can make. So it's up to India to choose, but India has some really, really positive possibilities ahead in this array of choices.
Thank you very much, Gary.